Pleasure to be with you again. Yesterday we talked about the home and mothers, wives, dads, fathers. Today we're going to be talking about child training. We have one point we need to finish up from parents, but it's also part of child training, and it has to do with apologies. And we need to make apologies because it's the right thing to do, but we also need to make apologies because it's the right thing to do to train our kids. How many of you work with or have some, extended family member or have to deal with somebody who is never wrong? I mean, when they're right, they're right, but when they're wrong, no, they weren't. And they will never apologize. You want your children to be with the Lord. You want your children to have eternal life. And they won't if they're that kind of person. And you also, just for life here, you don't want them to be that kind of person. Because who's getting fooled by that person who never, ever admits when they're wrong? Does it fool you? Do you realize, oh, he's perfect. She's perfect. No, that doesn't fool you. Does it fool the other people around them? Who's the only person being fooled? Yeah, the person that refuses to say they were wrong and apologize. So apologies are just an important, if we were perfect, then, if you're Jesus, you don't have to do a lot of apologizing. If you're me, you have to do a lot of apologizing. If you're you, you've got to do some apologizing. We're wrong sometimes, and sometimes we say things that are wrong. We cause things that create inconveniences. We're thoughtless and create problems for others. Or we get irritated and we say things in tones and in ways that we shouldn't have and react, in ways that are destructive instead of constructive. And that's when we need to realize and acknowledge that we were wrong. So, once we realize, okay, I've got to apologize. If you're not real good at apologies, if it's something new to you and you don't like it, but you realize you need to, there's some pretty sorries that we can give. There's the minimizing apology. Perhaps I made a mistake. Maybe my reaction wasn't the best. Well, no one's perfect after all. Is that really a good apology? If somebody's done you wrong and done other people wrong, done your family wrong, your children wrong, or whatever, and what do you feel when you hear those words? It's basically no big deal, maybe I wasn't perfect. Did you think they were? No, you don't think anybody's perfect. This is not a revelation to say nobody's perfect. That's kind of a known fact. There's the accusation apology. I'm sorry you got so upset over that. See, I said I'm sorry, didn't I? Did I say it? I said I'm sorry, but what did I say I'm sorry for? I'm sorry that you got so upset over that. I'm sorry you were so bothered by that. I'm sorry you took it the wrong way. In other words, here's your apology. Sorry you messed up, but it's your fault. Is that an apology? That's an accusation. That's an accusation dressed as an apology. There's a hypothetical apology. If I may have made a mistake, if I did anything that may have appeared to be wrong. In other words, I'm admitting nothing, likely did nothing, but supposing even if I did, let's consider it apologized for. Now, to be fair, there may be a situation sometime where you're dealing with, something at work or a school or something else, and people have attributed to you something that you didn't do, and they think, I think you meant this, and you didn't. And you might could say something like that on occasion because you really didn't do anything wrong. But when I did something wrong, that's not the time to pretend that this is a hypothetical. You know, or it just appeared that way. When I'm wrong, I'm wrong. And here's one that's really kind of tricky. I'm sorry, but. So suppose I've got your SUV borrowed, and I come in and there's a big scratch on the side, and there's, you know, nachos all over the carpet and everything else. And I say, I'm sorry about that, but if you would have had a bigger, you know, place for my food and had not asked me to park over there, what does the but do to the apology? It just guts it. And sometimes we're really tempted to do that. I'm sorry, but, and then we start saying a bunch of things, blaming somebody else. How effective is that? Is that the way you want to be apologized to? No, that's not how you want to apologize. So I don't have a verse that says, don't say, I'm sorry, but. There's not a verse on that. But there is a verse that says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And when somebody's done you wrong, do you want them to say, I'm sorry, but, and then make accusations and defensive statements? If you don't like that being done to you, don't do that to other people. And also, just as a practical point of advice, it's not very effective. Because what started out feeling like, oh, he said he's sorry, turns into what? It's just really annoying and frustrating. So, in communication between husbands and wives, or dealings with kids. Well, I'm sorry, but if you hadn't done this or done that, if you hadn't said this or said that, I'm sorry, but you were the one that, it's almost like you might as well not apologize. That's how it feels. I'm sorry, but I only reacted that way because you did such and such. Why do we do that? One, probably being defensive, but sometimes it's because they really did do something wrong. If I make a mess in your truck, that's just my fault. You know, that's not your fault at all. But sometimes, do we get in an argument and it gets heated, and partway through the argument we realize we're being unkind and unfair and exaggerating things and causing a quarrel? You ever got to that point? But do you also realize that the other person, whether it's your brother, your cousin, your wife, your husband, or whatever, but they are too? Have you ever had that? In other words, there's a reason you're annoyed. You're not annoyed because, you know, they just brought you a nice cup of hot cocoa. You're annoyed because of the really aggravating things they were saying and selfish ways they were behaving and unfair statements they were making, right? And so you get riled up. So part of us are saying, yeah, I know I was wrong, but you were wrong too. Often that's the case. Sometimes among brethren, there's trouble. Is it always 100% this guy's fault and 0% that guy's fault? Yeah, it sometimes when things get difficult, sometimes say, you know, this was my fault. That was your fault. And so part of us is wanting to say, okay, I'm sorry for my part, but there's your part. So here's a suggestion. This is just a suggestion. Reverse it. Don't say, I'm sorry, just very quickly, and then launch into, but you. Reverse it like this. If it's an argument between husband and wife, I'd like you to consider whether or not what you said was fair. But regardless of whether or not what you said was fair or not, I know what I said wasn't fair. And I wasn't being kind. And I was reacting defensively, and I spoke to you in a way I shouldn't have, and what I said wasn't true, and I'm sorry. And nothing, I'm sorry. Does that feel like an apology? Yes, it does, because they realize their part. But did you let them know there's something you want them to think about? Yes, it does. And then what are they probably going to say? Because they have the same concern that you did. You were both treating each other unfairly. You both got into that mode of, you always do such and such, or something. And then it's like, oh, he was wrong and he said it, but it is true I was being unfair at the and the other person apologizes. So that's just a much better way to do that. And then there's the angry apology. Fine, I'm sorry. It's not really an apology. Can you think of a really good apology in the Bible? The lost son. That's a good apology. Look with me at Luke chapter 15. When he came to his senses, verse 17, he said, how many of my father's hired men have food and to spare, and here I'm starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men. And he got up and he went back to his father. And when his father saw him, he was so glad to see him. He ran and he hugged him. Draw nigh unto God, he'll draw nigh unto you. But he doesn't say, oh, he's happy to see me, I'll skip. No, he went ahead and he said what he needed to say. And he was right. He didn't deserve to be his father's son. But in grace, he gets more than he deserved, which is what God does for us. But that's a real apology. He didn't try to minimize it. He didn't say, well, maybe I didn't do the best I could have with the inheritance. He didn't make an accusation, it's your fault, for giving it to me. He didn't make it hypothetical. He didn't say, okay, I'm sorry, but he apologized. He knew he was wrong. He said, I sinned against heaven in your sight. He humbled himself. And why is it that sometimes we don't want to do that? We don't want to look bad. Guess how I already look when I owe somebody an apology? I already look bad. That's what I'm apologizing for, that I did something bad. How does it look when I refuse to admit that? It doesn't make me look better. It makes me look worse. How does this tie into child training? Guess who needs to hear us apologize sometimes? Have you ever been unkind to your child? Reacted out of anger instead of love, or different things? Been too harsh with them? Did they notice it? They know the times when they were in trouble and they're corrected and they know it's out of love, and they got in trouble and they know it was out of love, and then there's a time that they can tell we're just annoyed and kind of lashing out at them or something. When we apologize to them, what does that do for the child? For one thing, dads, if it's a boy and you're dad, it shows him this is how a man handles being wrong. And if he learns at a young age, that's how a man handles being wrong, then he will apologize too. And then when he grows up, he won't be that guy at work. You remember when I asked you at the beginning, do you know this type of person? And most everybody here thought of somebody. Your child won't be that person, because they will have learned, oh, that's what you do when you're wrong. You admit it and you apologize, which is what we have to do before God. 1 John 1, if we confess our sins, he will forgive us. All right, let's move on now to early child training. We talked yesterday about this, so I'm not going to review it. Here's what they need from the mothers in Titus and the fathers in Deuteronomy, and the house built on serving God. By the way, there's biblical examples of parenting, both good and bad. Lot, not a good father. You've got the patriarchs. You got some really bad examples there. David was not a very good father. The son that tried to make himself king as David is dying, and it's supposed to be Solomon. The text says there, David had never at any time said to him, "Why are you doing this?" Which means in that respect, he was an even worse father than Eli, who was criticized for doing nothing other than saying, "Why are you doing this?" basically. We've got a lot of poor examples of fathers. Jonadab is a good example of a father. You remember when the Rechabites, there in Jeremiah, they're called, and they say, "Call the Rechabites, tell them to do this." They say, "No, we don't do that. Our father told us not to do that." And in that clan, they had some rules, by the way, that were not in the law of Moses. They were family rules. Don't be afraid to have some family rules. Don't make the mistake of making your children think that your family rules are automatically God's rules. Okay? Like if in your family you decide, the media industry has gotten so corrupt that we're going to be better off without a TV. A lot of families make that decision. That's a good decision. It doesn't mean that another family can't have a TV and skip all the rotten stuff and use it for some good things, right? But if in your family that's the rule, some people have the take your shoes off when you go in the house. Some people don't have that rule. Don't be afraid to have rules in your home for your family that are helpful for your family and the culture. But help them not become little Pharisees that when they go to somebody else's house, they let you wear shoes in the house. They have a TV, they're ungodly, or something like that. But Jonadab, he taught some things in his family, like we're not going to live in the cities. We're going to be shepherds. We're not going to do this or that. Don't be afraid to make some rules in your family that need to be made. Maybe you see one of the kids is starting to get interested in something that's becoming an idol for him. Like if the rich young ruler, maybe if his parents had seen, money is starting to be way too important for him, and made some rules about that, it might have helped him. But don't let your kids get the idea that every house rule in your family has to be everybody else's rule. Teach them to respect rules in other people's. So if they get to wear shoes in your house, that's fine. You go to grandpa's house where they take the shoes off, guess what you do? Respect the rules in that home. And then, of course, you have Lois and Eunice, who were a great influence for Timothy. Train up a child in the way he should go, even when he is old, he will not depart from it. This is a great passage to remember. I believe it's a truism. I think there are a lot of things in Proverbs that are, this is the way life works. It doesn't necessarily mean in all cases that you can't have an exception to it. I'll give you an example. Remember the verse we had up there earlier? A soft answer turns away wrath. Or I guess it was last night. A soft answer turns away wrath. Grievous words stir up anger. That's so. That is generally so. Will there ever be a time where somebody's so angry that a soft answer doesn't turn away wrath? Yeah, you can find exceptions to that. Is there ever a time when somebody speaks rather grievously, but somebody listens and corrects? Yeah, if you've got 3 or 4 state troopers and 3 or 4 canine units and they're all yelling at you, if you're smart, you're going to listen, no matter how grievously they're barking and yelling. But as a general rule, this is the way it works. Train up a child in the way he should go, even when he is old, he will not depart from it. A rod and reproof impart wisdom, but a child who is unrestrained brings shame to his mother. This principle, years ago I read an article about a book. I didn't read the whole book, just this article that was in a news magazine about it. It was Judith Harris was the author of the book, And she wrote a book about whether or not parents really matter. This is a number of years ago now. And it was reviewed in one of the news magazines, and fortunately the reviewer saw that there was some bad stuff in this book. But her position was, parents don't matter. And she believed children will be what they're going to be based on peers and genetics. And that's it. And so on the nature versus nurture debate, it's all nature, it's just DNA and peers. So what she said you can do, because they're going to be controlled by their peers, you need to make sure that you make enough money to have them in the best school district. And by the way, the people with the most money don't necessarily have the best kids when you stop and think about it. And then because you want them to be accepted in the right circles in that best school district, you need to make enough money that they can dress in the latest styles and fashion. And of course have braces and plastic surgery if need be, because looks are important, so that they'll be accepted. So that's what you can do as a parent. And as nonsense as that is, as I thought about it, I realized one thing. If you don't spend time with your children, then to a large extent, the parents aren't really going to matter. And peers and DNA and social media now are going to dictate what they are. But if you're an involved parent, what a world of difference it makes. It's kind of like a garden. I imagine some of you put in a garden last spring, right? If I live next door to you and you put in a garden, and in the spring I sowed some seed and didn't do anything else, and you tended your garden, at harvest time, what do you have? You got this abundance of these fantastic vegetables. What do I have? I got a patch of weeds and some scrawny little, vegetables here and there. I shouldn't be looking across the fence and saying, you're lucky, you had easy vegetables. That's not the difference. The difference was I planted some seed and didn't raise it. You made sure it was watered. If it wasn't raining, you went out there and you watered it. You gave some fertilizer in the ground. If a rabbit started eating stuff up, you put a little fence around it. You took care of your garden, and that's why you got the results that you got. And it makes a difference. Kittens, birds. How much time does a bird need with mom and dad? A cat needs 10 to 12 weeks. A bird takes babies, this is North American robin, takes babies about 2 weeks to leave the nest. Then they usually stay with their parents for 2 or 3 weeks after that. So how old is the baby right here? 7 months. 7 months. And still with you? I mean, at 1 month, if he was a robin, he'd be gone. This baby needs to learn a lot more than how to catch a worm and eat it. We're complex beings, and we're given by God a huge amount of time for training. Use that time. Deuteronomy 6. Would one of you brothers please read verse 6 and 7?
These words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise.
This is something that needs to go on in the family. It can be structured, it can be casual, interactive. Hey, look at that. And then use that for, you can be going down the road and there's a bunch of people in orange picking up trash and they're not volunteers. There's, the sheriff's deputy over there and explaining, do you know why those men are, it's a good thing they're doing out there. Do you know why they're there? Explain, probably a lot of those guys didn't have a daddy that cared about them and taught them how to obey God. And a lot of boys grow up without anybody caring about their soul and teaching them right from wrong. And then they start running around with people doing bad things and they get arrested. And all these guys are now in jail and say, I don't want that to ever happen to you. And that's why, in other words, just use things around you as opportunities to help them learn. And again, then in Ephesians, please turn over to Ephesians chapter 6. Verse 4. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. And start early. There's such a thing as parents expecting too much of a child, and we'll talk about that later. That's not usually the problem in our culture. Usually we expect far too little of children. Children can be capable of great good and great learning, and we sometimes just drop the ball and don't give them the opportunity to do as much and rise as high as they can. We will talk later about unrealistic expectations, but by and large, that's not the problem going on in this nation today. And it starts with, I'm going to start with basic vocabulary, lesson 1. Now I'm going to make a statement here, and it is a little bit hyperbole, it's a little bit exaggerated, but I don't think by much. If you will do what I'm about to show here, in one way, you've got about half your job done as a parent. And I'll explain why in a minute. What does that word mean? Now, when kids are little, sometimes their first word will be mama. My little granddaughter, her first word, turned out she just started saying dada. But those are early on. But another word that they learn early on is the word no. And if you will teach your little one what no means, and that no is to be respected, and when no is from an authority, mom or dad, etc., it is to be obeyed, but it is not to be used defiantly by the child. It can be used in answer by the child. Would you like another cookie? No, thank you, I'm full. There's nothing wrong with that. But that defiant business, that no, because they learn that no is a powerful word. If you train your child to respect the word no and not use it defiantly, half your job is already done. Because you have laid the groundwork for most of the things to come. Let's talk about why. First off, very simply, no happens to mean no. That's what it means. There's the importance of no. In Genesis chapter 2, God has Adam in the garden and he gives him a rule. And what's the rule? No on this tree right here. You may eat of any of the tree in the garden, but of this tree right here, thou shalt not eat. This is a no right here. How old was Adam? I assume he was physically, adult in appearance. How long has he been around? How much wisdom does he have? He's kind of new to the scene. And then Eve comes along, and she's new to the scene as well. And God gave them a no. And then like a 4-year-old, what does Eve do? And what does Adam do? When they're taking out the Israelites out of Egypt, the Ten Commandments are not the greatest commandments. They're really good commandments, but they're not the greatest ones. You know how I know that the Ten Commandments are not the greatest commandments? How do we know that the Ten Commandments are not the greatest ones? Because when Jesus was asked which is the greatest commandment, he didn't quote a single one of the Ten Commandments. He quoted Deuteronomy 6, love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. That's our vertical relationship. And then Leviticus 19, love your neighbor as yourself. He said all the other rules hang on that. Like Paul said in Romans, if you love your neighbor, that's going to cover no on the killing, no on the adultery, no on the coveting, no on the false witness. That's going to cover it all. But if you look at the Ten Commandments, most of them are no-nos. No killing, no stealing, no bearing false witness. We need some specifics. The more mature we get, the less we need it. That's why Paul says, owe no man anything except to love one another. Because if you love, that'll take care of all that stuff. But if we take all the 2- and 3-year-olds in this congregation and we ask one person to watch them during the potluck or whatever, and this is what I would tell people when I left my kids with them. I said, deal with him like you would deal with yours. If he misbehaves, go ahead and deal with it. And some people say, no, I'm not going to let it. If I don't trust somebody else with my child, I don't leave my child with that person. I don't leave my children with people I don't trust. But if you said, oh, don't worry, we're not going to have any rules. I'm just going to tell the children that we will just all respect each other and we won't need any rules. Okay, good luck with that, because you know what? After about 30 minutes, you're going to have to get some specific rules. No kicking, no biting, no. And the Israelites, and we need some specifics, but a lot of them are no-nos. Respect and compliance for the prohibitory no. When the child learns, oh, mom said no, and then she backed it up, that's a real powerful lesson. If you don't mean it, don't say it. If you do mean it, enforce it. Jesus said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. I knew a guy, he would get so frustrated with his mom. One time he said, I'd like to just slap her, which was a terrible thing for a teenage boy to say about his mom. But she would irritate him because she was out, no. And he would argue and plead his case until finally, well, how long will you be gone? And it was just annoying because he had to go through this thing. Saying no more times doesn't make you a better parent. Not everything needs to be no, okay? Mom, can we play in the interstate? No. Can we play on the highway? No. Can we play in the road? No. Can we play in the yard? Yes. It's not, can we have fun? No. Can I breathe in and out? No. That doesn't mean you're a good parent. There needs to be lots of yeses. Could we go back to that pizza place sometime? Yeah. Dad, could we play ball sometime today? Yeah. There should be lots of yeses in life. But no's need to be no's. So, vocabulary test. What does no mean to my child? Well, we'll have another test later, but this one's vocabulary test. If you've got a 2, 3, 4-year-old, whatever, and a 5-year-old, 16-year-old, whatever, if to them your no means tantrum time, then you got some work to do because you haven't established with them what no means. If your child thinks no means the defense attorney may now cross-examine, you're doing it wrong. And you don't say, well, I finally won the argument. I out-debated him. It's not your job to out-debate the child. Let me tell you something. The child that learns to respect no from his mother and father at age 1 and 2 is a child whose heart is prepped to accept no from his eternal Father. Have you known brethren who treat God's no's as something to argue about and try to work their way around against? Help the child. If your child thinks no means don't do it while mom or dad are watching, then you haven't got established what no means. If your child thinks, oh, mom said no, I can't do that, you're doing a really, really, really good job, and half your work's done. Why do I say that? Because that child has learned to respect authority. At age 1, at age 2, that child has already learned to respect authority. That child has also learned, I won't always get my way, and shouldn't. That child has learned that behavior is more important than desire. And that child has learned self-denial and self-control. Now, let me explain what I said earlier. When your child is 16 and they're off with some other 16-year-olds and somebody stops by at a party somewhere, if your child has ingrained to them and understands at their moral core, I need to respect God's authority and my parents' authority. I will not always get my way, and my behavior is more important than my desire. And there are things that I need to deny myself and I need to control myself. How important is that going to be when your child walks in there and people start trying to offer them, get them to drink this or smoke that or take that, or somebody starts hitting on them in a sexual way and such? If that child has not learned these rules, what's going to happen? So the challenges will change. It's not like, okay, he's 2 and he's learned to respect no, we're done. No, you're not done. There's going to be a lot of challenges, but you've got the foundation established. And they have learned these things right there. This is it's learning to submit to an earthly father prepares the child for submission to a far more important father. And the relationship with that father will also include lots of yeses and lots of blessings. But we need to start with being able to understand, no, there are some things you don't do. And when you're 1 and 2, you don't do it because mommy said no. Daddy said no. So help your child to do that. And don't put up with a child going, no, because they start to learn the power of no, and then they'll decide maybe sometime to employ it. If they do, let them learn very firmly and very seriously that they can never act that way to you, and get that straightened out. And a lot of your work will be done. Respect and compliance for the prohibitory no, 0 tolerance for the defiant and rebellious no. Avoid upside down homes. If you're looking for a house and the realtor says, here's one, you say, yeah, I'd like to take a look at that. You don't want to buy that one. You don't care if the bathroom's just been renovated. You don't care if it has granite countertops. You don't care if it has recessed lighting. That's a useless house. You know, the hardwood floors are up there. The recessed lighting is down there. This is a terrible house. Yet that is the kind of home a lot of people live in. This is, I think, from Michael Pearl. It's mostly from him. He's a fellow who did some writing, and I just thought this was well worded. I might have altered it a little bit, but I think it's mostly his. Said, too many children view the home, the parents, the food, etc., as merely a means to an end to satisfy and please the child. The child makes his demands, manipulates the parents via tantrums and repeated misbehavior. Parents bow to the will of the child in efforts to placate and appease his whims and dissatisfactions, or suffer through increased strife and conflict when they cannot. The home is like a house built upside down. The child needs to understand that it is not child, parents, God. It's the other way around. It's God. And below God is dad and mom, and he's down here. And he needs to understand that. The rod and reproof give wisdom. A child left to himself brings shame to his mother. I'm going to give you a story now, and then we'll take a break, and then I'll give you another story. But this is years ago, and this was a couple, members of a nearby church, and they had a 4-year-old. And 3 and 4 are some of my favorite ages. 4 is just such a great age. And so I'm about to say something that is kind of uncomfortable to say. I did not like this child. In a minute, you're going to see why I didn't like this child, but it kind of hurts to say, I don't like that child. His mother had read some books with kind of the modern pop psychology that you don't, really discipline a child, don't spank a child, etc. And he was a result of that. And he would just ignore his folks. They'd be over here yelling for him, to protect the guilty, I'll change the name, William! And he just ignores him. William! I lived near the family. William, get over here! And he just ignores him. William, get over here right now! He just ignores him. And every little bit, they yell for him, and he just keeps ignoring them, playing with his little buddy. As he walks across, I say, William, why didn't you go when your parents called you? I didn't hear them. And his little buddy said, yes, you did. One time I opened my car door, and there's just a big pile of dirt, on my cloth seat in the car, thanks to William. One time William opened my door. He didn't knock or anything. He just opened my door, 4 years old. The front of his overalls are soaking wet, and the back are brown. And he says, I don't have to use the bathroom. Now you can understand why usually when I'm around a 4-year-old, I'm like, oh, cool. This is a delight to be around. It was not a delight to be around William. Nobody enjoyed being around William. And it wasn't William's fault. He was doing things he should have been punished for. But ultimately, at age 4, if you've got a mother foolish enough to listen to pop psychology instead of the Word of God, who's to blame for the situation right there? I don't know what happened to William. And at some point, if William didn't get himself straightened out, he's responsible now for whoever he ended up being. But at age 4, you know where that fault lies? With the parents. The rod and reproof bring wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. A 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, there's so many beautiful things, and they can do so much good and so much sweetness, but it's not without training. They need training to know, oh, that's not the way to behave, this is. That's what we're there for. And when we don't do that job, that's a terrible thing to do to a little child. Let's take a break.